afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. It's my second trip to Buenos Aires, a city I really enjoy coming back to. That very long introduction makes me feel very old. It seems like I've done far too much. It's time to retire as well. Médecins Sans Frontières, or in Spanish, Médicos Sin Fronteras, in the field we're just known as MSF, is a medical humanitarian organization. And this year marks the 40th anniversary of our founding. So it was 40 years ago this year that doctors and journalists came together in Paris to create this international movement. It's truly international at the moment. We have about 27,000 people. There are 27,000. Yeah, sure. Is this better? Yes. So we have about 27,000 staff members working in 65 countries around the world. We, as an organization, like I said, we are truly international. We have an office or a presence in Argentina for the past 10 years, and we have responded to certain floods, certain natural disasters in the country, and have been working in the region, especially with the people affected by Charlas disease, and also a long presence in Colombia. I don't need to explain what the situation in Colombia is, and of course in Central America, in the Caribbean. So we have a long presence and long history of action in this part of the world as well. So what I'll do is I'll talk about politicization of aid and keep it short, and then maybe we can have a discussion afterwards. I also have some colleagues here with me, perhaps they can also join, and we can have a really interesting discussion on some of these issues afterwards. All right. Humanitarian action, by its very definition, is an impartial act. In conflict settings, it cannot be funded or directed by governments involved. It must have no other agenda than that of alleviating the suffering of those who need help. In recent years, this distinction has been blurred. As a result, humanitarian action has been seen as agenda-driven, with humanitarian actors at risk and humanitarian assistance unable to reach those who most need it. The increasing politicization of humanitarian aid is what I'll talk about today. As a doctor, if I see someone in urgent need of medical care, I act. I do not ask questions other than to establish a diagnosis. I cannot have any other interest other than the immediate survival of the person in front of me. Anything else comes later. The humanitarian idea is similarly modest: to help people survive. Humanitarian action aims to help people when they are going through a very difficult time, whether it is because of war, disease, hunger, grief, or fear. It aims to alleviate suffering, restore people's health and function, and re-establish their capacities for choice. We are Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. We are a medical humanitarian organization. When we provide assistance in war zones, our purpose is not to end wars or to build peace. When we work in weak states, it is not to build democracy or defend human rights. Nor does humanitarian action concern itself with building health systems. Humanitarian action is focused on people. It is simply about saving lives and alleviating suffering. This marks a fundamental difference between two ways of thinking: a humanitarian way that is humane, independent, impartial, and neutral, and a rights-based approach that seeks to address root causes of poverty and precarity. That's a very fundamental distinction between humanitarian work and development work. I'm going to elaborate some humanitarian principles. 1. Humanity. Humanity reaffirms the notion that all people have equal value and dignity. Impartiality, which dictates that assistance be provided based solely on need, without distinction or discrimination. Neutrality, which means refraining from taking part in hostilities or taking actions that advantage one side of the conflict over another. And the last, and also very important, independence, which is necessary to ensure that humanitarian action only serves the interests of the people most in need and not political, religious, or other agendas. Why are these principles important? These principles ground our activities in two critical ways. The first is to keep humanitarian action focused on need, and to ensure assistance is delivered unconditionally and with no other motives. The second is an operational tool to aid access to populations by building trust among communities. Our independent action, free of association with any ideology or political stance, is the best guarantee we will be able to reach people in crisis. When NATO Secretary General Rasmussen calls on NGOs to be a soft power to complement NATO's hard power, he's confusing matters a lot. When Colin Powell in 2001 described NGOs as force multipliers who are such an important part of our combat team, he's not helping them either. Such blurring of the lines between actors with very different objectives does not help us to build trust with communities we seek to assist. The breach of trust in aid workers in Afghanistan, for example, comes from many instances in which NATO soldiers have deliberately portrayed themselves as aid workers. Whether they are soldiers or contractors, they often drive around in white vehicles dressed in civilian clothes. And this is an increasing tendency, especially when a lot of the work of the military is subcontracted to outfits like Halliburton, etc. When UN or Western militaries claim to use military force to further humanitarian objectives or goals, they are unilaterally projecting a unity of purpose between humanitarian agencies and intervention or occupation forces. As many of our field workers come from the same countries that decide upon, finance and furnish the troops NATO commands in Afghanistan, we are all labeled foreign belligerents. Our claim to act independently of our countries of origin and of those other so-called humanitarians who dress the same way and drive the same cars is met with strong skepticism by local actors, especially those hostile to international political or military intervention. I was in Denmark recently, and there are these advertisements which are actually asking young people to join the military, and the reason is humanitarian. So if you want to do humanitarian work around the world, join the military. And this is the tone of a lot of the military recruitment these days. So young people who join the military are also joining David for all the right reasons. So it's not the military that we blame, but there is a real confusion that exists in the field today, where the people who are receiving assistance are not able to tell who is who in these sort of situations. Humanitarians believe that calling military delivery of aid humanitarian is extremely problematic. Humanitarian actors such as MSF do not take positions against wars, but we are strongly committed to non-violent modes of action in the delivery of aid. Shoot to feed or shoot to heal are abhorrent to our modus operandi ethics and principles. and we oppose any conditionality in the delivery of humanitarian aid. Aid must be delivered in response to people's need. It may not be used to obtain information, which is often what happens when aid is delivered by the military. Especially when it comes to the notion of so-called humanitarian wars. When NATO intervened in Kosovo, it portrayed its mission as humanitarian, as responding to people's suffering. Troops were primarily depicted as caregivers to the massive numbers of refugees fleeing Serbia. But the humanitarian war is a dangerous corruption of the humanitarian ideal. It suggests that violence is legitimate means to deliver humanitarian assistance, and it confuses two profoundly distinct human endeavors. Occupying forces have a clear obligation under the Geneva Conventions to protect and care for civilians under their control. The delivery of aid in compliance with the international humanitarian law is part of the military's work. But this is not and cannot be called humanitarian action. So we are not opposed to the military providing assistance. In fact, we see it as there is an obligation for them to do it. But you should not confuse this with humanitarian assistance. Humanitarians have come to be labeled as allies by Western powers and as soft targets by enemies of Western powers. But the present confusion is also in part the responsibilities of NGOs. Organizations that are in fact more geared towards goals such as sustainable development, gender equality, justice, and so on, are willing partners of the Afghan government and other belligerents, and are presenting themselves as humanitarian. But humanitarian aid is for the Afghans and Somalis. Somalia is another difficult context. Humanitarian aid is for the Afghans and Somalis of today. Development programs are for Afghanistan, the Afghanis and Somalis of tomorrow. The objectives of more development-oriented organizations may be laudable. In fact, they do have a big role to play, but they are not, we consider, humanitarian. Their assistance is directed by different priorities, which perhaps means that complete independence is less critical to their work. But lack of strict independence has morphed into dependence. A dual dependency has grown up in the aid sector between donor governments depending on NGOs to implement their objectives in conflict settings, and NGOs depending on donor governments to safeguard their presence in these crises. So there's a dual dependency. Given this context, it is easy to understand the perception of local people that aid agencies are contributing to the war effort and state-building policies of one side of the conflict. So people are confused. In Afghanistan, what we see is that massive resources of the aid system, both the UN and NGO, support the Afghan government and the objectives of the Western intervention forces. Looked at critically, the aid system in Afghanistan can be said to operate as an implementing partner of NATO's policies. So, when both the military and multi-mandated NGOs co-opt the humanitarian lexicon, it is no wonder that opposing armed groups or oppressive governments may not want humanitarian actors around. Or the fact that health workers are targeted or unable to reach people where help is most needed. And this is the case in Somalia today. What are some of the consequences of politicization? When humanitarian goals and activities are lumped together with a broader and more future-oriented development agenda, and when a comprehensive approach is used to justify the unity of purpose that NATO talks about, there is one immediate and direct result. People caught up in the conflict do not receive the assistance to which they have a right. More and more organizations are today perceived as allies of one side of a conflict. Thus, fewer organizations able to work in areas that are not under the control of Afghan government, or for that matter, the transitional federal government in Somalia. Perhaps once there was a time when humanitarian workers provided emergency assistance and were then replaced by development agencies. So there was an emergency phase and then a development phase. In today's complex and often chronic humanitarian crises, both kind of programs must learn to work alongside one another and must respect each, that their goals and approaches are not the same. If humanitarian workers are to save lives in conflict zones, they need unhindered access to those zones, their neutrality and independence, and their perceived neutrality and independence. So it's not just important to be principled, you have to be perceived as being principled. It's vital to gaining that access. Earlier this year, it was revealed that CIA carried out a fake vaccination campaign to confirm Osama bin Laden's whereabouts in Pakistan. This was a grave manipulation of the Medical Act. The risk is that vulnerable communities, not just in Pakistan, anywhere, needing access to essential health services will understandably question the true motivation of medical workers and humanitarian aid. The potential consequence is that even basic healthcare, including vaccination services, does not reach those who need it most. The impact of the cynical ploy will not just be felt in Pakistan, but also in countries such as Nigeria, where polio campaigns are already seen as an American conspiracy to depopulate the developing world. So there are already enough conspiracy theories out there. If the credibility of humanitarian action is under suspicion, be it in Afghanistan, Somalia, or in Colombia, where soldiers dressed as Red Cross workers tricked FARC guerrillas into handing over the kidnapped politician Ingrid Betancourt. The Colombian soldiers wore Red Cross vests when they did that. There is a growing tendency to target health workers and health facilities, to the point where in some places it's no longer possible to safely deliver or receive health care. In Afghanistan, in 2004, 5 of our colleagues were assassinated in a deliberately targeted attack. Attacks on the NGO community in Afghanistan had grown from once a month in 2002 to once a day, just a year later. So you can see how quickly the situation deteriorated. In May 2009, a clinic was destroyed in Khost, in Afghanistan, and staff threatened by an armed group. In November 2009, a suspected group of militants burned a clinic in southern Kandahar.